Welcome back to Developing Story and our weekly updates on the Amazon Synod. I'm Ashley McKinless, the host of the Jesuitical podcast and an editor here at America Media. Joining me for this update is Father Luke Hansen, America's special correspondent for the Amazon Synod. Welcome back, Luke.
Good to be with you, Ashley.
So, Luke, the Amazon Synod is now halfway over. In week one, we saw participants taking up several big ideas, including environmental protections, ministry roles for women, and ordaining mature married men to the priesthood. How have those conversations been developing over this past week?
Well, one thing I've noticed is that in the first week of the Synod, we had a number of experts who were at the press briefings who were talking about the importance of Indigenous rights and how the climate is changing and what the effects on Indigenous communities are. But this week, we've been hearing more from Indigenous leaders themselves. And in their testimonies at the press briefings, they brought a lot of passion because they've been able to describe what's at stake for them personally, what's at stake for their communities, and how they're being affected by extractive practices of multinational corporations and the effects of climate change on their communities. When I've spoken with bishops who have been inside the Synod Hall, they said some of the most moving interventions have come from those Indigenous leaders. So there's a personal element to the sharing that's happened this week that I think has had an impact on the Synod.
What about new roles for men and women in ministry?
So the bishops are still on a daily basis talking about the possibility of ordaining married men to the priesthood. And bishops are describing that possibility in the context of a very severe shortage of clergy in the region. But we've also heard a few voices, they might be in the minority, but a few bishops who have sort of cautioned this conversation about ordaining married men to the priesthood. One at a press briefing said that, celibacy is not the real problem, but it's the holiness of priests and the example that they give. And if priests provided a better witness and lived a more simple life, more men would be attracted to the priesthood. Another bishop has talked about the importance to look at the distribution of priests around the world and whether some parts of the world who have more priests might consider sending as missionaries priests to the Amazon region where there's a shortage. Some people have raised the concern that, the issue of celibacy and the issue of women in ministry are really issues that have to be dealt with and addressed by the global church. So maybe it's better for these issues to be discussed in a future synod, a global synod, rather than this regional Amazonian synod.
What are the conversations about the role of women like? Is the idea of women in the diaconate still a live concern at the Synod?
Almost every bishop who's spoken at the press briefings has been able to very eloquently and profoundly describe the ministry that women are already doing in the region. Ministry of the Word, serving as catechists, being involved in ministries of charity. So for some of the bishops, they've said very clearly that women in the region are already doing the work of deacons, and they would be very happy to ordain women as permanent deacons in the region. Other bishops have passed on answering that specific question about the diaconate. And other ideas that have come up in the past few days have been instituting women as lectors or as acolytes. Right now, only lay men can be instituted officially into those ministries, even though, of course, women are already doing those ministries in many parts of the world. Or maybe they're in the region, they could develop an official ministry of the Word where women would be trained as preachers of the Word in local communities. So a number of different ideas have come up. Some have explicitly said they'd like to see women ordained as deacons, but other ideas are being discussed as well.
So at this point in the Synod, we're also seeing some concrete proposals emerge. And these aren't guaranteed to be part of the final document or to be taken up by Pope Francis when the Synod ends, but they do tell us about the direction and the priorities of the Synod Fathers. So what have some of those proposals been?
One proposal that we've heard about several times is creating a bishops' organization for the region that isn't divided by one of the national boundaries, but it's a bishops' conference for the Pan-Amazonian region. And that bishops' conference, which could involve laypersons at every level, would be charged with implementing the synod and some of the decisions that Pope Francis will make after the synod. It can also be charged with protecting indigenous rights, working for the protection of the environment. So a number of bishops have voiced the need for that type of ecclesial organization in the Amazon. Another topic that's being discussed is the inculturation of the liturgy and whether it's best to incorporate some indigenous practices and traditions into the Roman liturgy, or whether to create a Catholic indigenous rite that is unique to the region and that incorporates a number of the valued liturgical expressions of indigenous communities. So those are a couple of the proposals that have received some discussion in the Synod. The idea of having more theological reflection on ecological sins has also come up several times to make sure that Catholics understand their moral responsibility to protect the environment and to always see the connection between the protection of the environment and the promotion of human life, and that the protection of the environment is a pro-life issue.
Speaking of these concrete proposals, the list of people who will write the Synod's final document of recommendations to the Pope was just announced. Who are some of the key people on that team, and what do they tell us about what's likely to be included?
Well, of the president and the 12 members of the writing team, 4 of them are cardinals. So I think we can look to them as some of the key members who will play an important role in drafting the final document. So one of them is Cardinal Humes, who was very involved in the preparation for the Synod. He's a Franciscan from Brazil. Another cardinal who's on the writing team is Michael Cherney, who is a Canadian Jesuit, and he just became a cardinal on the eve of the Synod. And he's worked with Cardinal Turkson in the Office for Promoting Integral Human Development for a number of years. And Cardinal Cherney was very instrumental in the development of the encyclical Laudato Si. So his expertise in both ecological concerns, but also migration and refugees, could play an important role in the drafting of this document. And then finally, I'd mention Cardinal Schönborn from Vienna, who would be considered the theological heavyweight on the writing team. He has the trust of Pope Francis. So I think, each of these 3 will play an important role in the development of this document. And it's interesting that each of them is religious. So one is a Dominican, one is a Jesuit, one is a Franciscan. And half of the members of the writing team are from religious orders. And I think that reflects that, for a long time, the Amazonian region was missionary territory. So there's more than half of the members of this synod are members of a religious order.
That's fascinating. This is a little harder to quantify, but I'm wondering about the atmosphere at the Synod. It seems like it's been different this time around. We've heard about how bishops and lay auditors seem really comfortable with one another, and also the participation of Indigenous people it looks very moving. So you've been in the Synod Hall. What stood out to you this week?
Yeah, it's clear that there's a lot of familiarity among the participants in the Synod because the vast majority of them come from the Amazonian region. So there are common languages. Almost everyone speaks Spanish or Portuguese. And there's a sense of, even among the diversity of cultures within the region, there's also a shared culture and understanding of each other. And I think that's enabled the Synod participants to get to business more quickly. There wasn't, sometimes at the beginning of a global Synod where people are coming from every part of the world, there's kind of a little bit more discomfort, and it takes a little bit more time to kind of settle in and to get to know each other. But it's happened much more quickly at this Synod. Like I mentioned earlier, the presence of Indigenous leaders has been really significant. And when I've talked with bishops who have been on the inside, a number of them have mentioned that the most moving interventions have come from Indigenous leaders who are describing what's at stake for them personally and for their communities. And often the loudest applause has followed their interventions. So their impact is really being felt inside the Synod Hall.
All right, Luke, thank you so much for these updates, giving us a behind-the-scenes look at the Synod. And for all of our coverage of the Synod on the Amazon, visit americamag.org/Amazon Synod 2019. And for more videos like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel. For America Media, I'm Ashley McKinless. We'll see you next week.